I wanted to give you a little update in sort of big picture terms about the war. I'm very grateful for your kind wishes for my health. I'm beginning to sit up now for short periods of the day, and I look forward to returning with bigger videos on the main channel soon. And you've been amazing in the comment section, and the feedback to what we're chatting about on the main channel has been absolutely incredible in its positivity, and I'm thankful to you. But where are we with this war, big picture wise? I think that sometimes you see a comment under pretty much any good analytical article or video about this war, which says, well, is there going to be a next, and who is next? And I say that we can't know that, but there is a chance Ukraine is next. And people say, what are you talking about? They've just been brutally assaulted by the Russians. We've got half of Ukrainian kids losing their homes. We've got death, destruction, massacres. What do you mean they're next? It's happening now. What next? Ukrainian war are you talking about? Well, we know that there's a very positive story here for Ukraine, because Ukraine has come together as a civic entity and can now be a much more functional and much less corrupt democracy than it was earlier. And so there really genuinely is a powerful good news story for Ukraine. But the bad news for Ukraine is that Putin hasn't given up his aspirations to take full political control over Ukraine and to erase Ukraine's sovereignty. That's still the aim, which means that this war could drag on for a long time with lots of unpredictable turns, which means that there could be a kind of tragic chop-up of territory which leads to a long ceasefire and perhaps a long peace, mostly peace. But then Putin might try again. The Western sanctions are not aimed at getting the Russian people to rise up. That's not going to happen. They're aimed at hitting Russia back, because this is a war and the sanctions are an act of war. But they're also aimed at saying, well, look, whatever happens to you Russian citizens as a result of these sanctions, sorry. But what we are trying to do is take out your economic, political, and social infrastructure to make sure you guys are in trouble and you can't go on invading other countries in the future as easily. That's basically the aim of the sanctions. So that's a valid enterprise, and we're going to have to see if it's successful or not. But the problem is that the key aspiration for Putin can't change. For him, and here I really agree with my colleague from Moscow, Grigory Yudin, who is a philosopher and sociologist, for Putin this is a defensive war. Just going to take this delivery quickly, sorry. Thank you for your patience. It's a defensive war from Putin's point of view. And one of the reasons it's a defensive war is to do with how he'd be thinking about power dynamics and how he'd be thinking about Russia's civilizational interests. And for him, the two are connected. So his stay in power and Russia's civilizational integrity. Well, the border between the two for Putin now is permeable and unclear. Now, we have spoken a bit about power dynamics in the Kremlin on the main channel, and we've said that Putin's power has been relatively reduced recently, and that's reflective not just of the fluidity of the regime, different people doing different things at different times, but also the fact that domestic policy became something Putin was refereeing rather than leading. But that's changed with the war. Putin is leading now because he's always led on foreign policy, and now foreign policy has eaten domestic policy. But these are the power dynamics we've discussed before, and they aren't the power dynamics he's thinking about. He's thinking about more radical power dynamics, which is when the regime is in existential crisis, when his stay in power is under immediate risk. He knows that's not going to come from a mass popular uprising, but he knows that various factors, including public mood, could conspire to a situation in which he is vulnerable. And if and when that happens, the last thing he wants is a Ukraine that looks like a Western country, that has very, very strong links with the West. Whether it's in NATO or not is actually secondary here. And the problem here is that culturally and politically, that kind of Ukraine will constitute a grave threat to Putin at a time when his regime is vulnerable. Moreover, via Ukraine, he would fear, at that time of vulnerability, various Western techniques of intervention and manipulation could be inserted to maximize Putin's chances of toppling. What he doesn't want is to reach a situation where his power is in the balance and there are all kinds of formal and informal Western influences in Ukraine that could interact with the situation, just tilt it against Putin. Putin wants to be fairly confident that when shit hits the fan, that he's going to be able to effectively clamp down. So Ukraine, without NATO, as an independent sovereign state with democracy or very strong democratic elements, is an existential threat to Putin, and in his mind is an existential threat to Putin's civilizational aspirations for Russia. So that's where we are on that. I wanted to say a little bit about nuclear war because we've done 2 videos on the main channel about it and we haven't spoken about it since. And when we talk about nuclear war, or when you listen to me rave on about the risk we are exposed to, I would love you to be aware of who I am. That's to say that you're not listening to a professional military analyst, and you're not even listening to a professional international relations scholar. And therefore, you should understand that I'm speaking to you about nuclear risk in my capacity as a very minor public intellectual whose private intellectual or properly professional intellectual work has some overlap with these kinds of issues, but isn't directly about them. And you know that my personal work is about how human beings live their lives, and particularly the bit of their lives that's mediated by the institutions they share. And that does mean war. That is a key way human beings have interacted via political institutions for all of human history. But, it's 100% my expertise to tell you what, Immanuel Kant thought about peace and war. It's not 100% my expertise to talk to you about nuclear risk. And there are some things that I just have literally not more knowledge of than you, which is certain technical military things, for example. So this is where I'm coming from. So it's a kind of a 55% professional view, because I'm bringing to bear my political philosophy sense. But, well, you've got it now, you know. So given that, what do I think about where we're at now? I think the slightly bad news is that it's not possible to take the nuclear story off the cards. And that's really, really important, because there are very many highly intelligent people who just want to take it off the table, take the nuclear option off the table as something that's a threat to us. Putin will never go there, they think. And they use typically various bits of almost rational choice theory. Well, can you imagine a circumstance where it's advantageous to Putin? And that, in my opinion, very clearly and firmly needs to be rejected. We've mentioned Andrei Kozyrev before, Russia's ex-foreign minister from the early 90s, who thinks it's impossible, essentially, for Putin to start a nuclear war. Many people take that kind of view. Anne Applebaum, who is a remarkable historian very formidable, has just beautiful qualities, some blind spots. She's also been sympathetic to this. Let's not worry about the nuclear risk with Putin. He's not going to go there. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, just at all. In other words, the nuclear risk could be low, it could be higher, but to say that it's for effective purposes zero simply makes no sense. And I tell you what it's an expression of. It's an expression of a prejudice that, in fact, expresses so many things that we get wrong. And this is a really important prejudice. Probably the most important prejudice we've mentioned, certainly on this channel, this second channel. And it's this. Humans tend to think that the future will be like the recent past. Humans tend to think that the future will be like the recent past. It won't. It won't. The future will be like the past. And that's very different to the recent past. And that is why, if you go into bookshops in airports, you're going to see very many Steven Pinker books that look at patterns over the last few decades. And they say, well, look, we're going to take a break. I think we're good now. So that's a very important prejudice, that the future will be like the recent past, and it's false. The future is going to be like the past. And that's why in airports you see so many books by Steven Pinker, and Pinker in these books traces things that have happened in recent history and ascribes to them a tendency that's not just contingent but somehow more than contingent. And that's why nobody in serious philosophy thinks that Steven Pinker is a serious thinker, even though he is very likable and admirable and clearly very smart. So that's a prejudice that's also applicable to the previous stuff we discussed. Putin's plan for the continuation of this war, for a second invasion of Ukraine potentially. And that's to say, we're not used to thinking of somebody with a crazed worldview that's partly prudential, partly sort of soaked in mysterious, fake spiritual civilizational ideas, somebody on the basis of that material of reasons engaging in brutal territorial war. And we need to understand that's not an aberration. That's history. History is full of these things. Putin is normal historically. He seems abnormal to us because we are confusing the recent history with human history. And one of the things, sadly, this century will teach us is that they're different things, and that a good stretch for a bit of the world, like we've had in the West, and we've had so many problems in the West, we've had so many issues that we still need to think about hard, various kinds of constitutive disadvantage, but nevertheless, we've had a relatively decent run in the West, and we should not confuse that simply with how human history is going to go now. So that's an important prejudice to put on the table, and that covers this, bit of the nuclear story where people say, let's take it off the table. Now, if it's going to stay on the table, what next? What do we do with it next? And I think that it's not really possible, at least for all intents and purposes that matter to us, to go too wild and worried about nuclear war next week or the week after. And that's because we're several steps of escalation away from nuclear war being an imminent risk. And so there's no reason to have sleepless nights now. If you want to have sleepless nights, have them later, if and when steps of escalation go far enough. So that's the good news, that we're not in a place where nuclear war could happen tomorrow. Now, anything can always happen, but in terms of whether you should be worried about it, the answer to the question, could nuclear war happen next week, is really no, it couldn't. Effectively, it couldn't. But where are we on this pattern of escalation? Are we getting further away from the more imminent risk? Or are we getting closer? We're getting closer. I mean, the more this war goes on, for instance, the more likely is direct contact between NATO and Russian forces. So nuclear war is not something we can simply take off the table. We are quite a few steps of escalation away from being imminent risk. But the trend in mild steps is taking us toward the direction we don't want. And that's why we need to keep reflecting on it, and being in a healthy dynamic with how we think about it. That's the nuclear update, and that's a little bit of an update, I think, on the ominousness of this Putin regime. Maybe one thing more to mention, this third point perhaps in our chat, and we'll finish with this, is that Putin has really reformatted the regime. I mean, we made this clip on the main channel, about Putin's fascist turn, and now we are seeing a fundamental shift in a fascist direction in Russia. It's not complete. We're not seeing a full-blown totalitarianism. We're not seeing military mobilization. We're not seeing sort of blank criminalization of any sort of anti-government free speech. That's still allowed to happen under certain circumstances in pockets. But we are seeing not just more terror. We are seeing mild steps toward trying to totalize citizens, steps toward trying to make sure citizens think within a certain script. And we've got pushes for that, not just in terms of top-down repression, but in terms of, FSB officers being appointed in university bureaucracies, toward cultures of denunciation being encouraged in the workplace. So we're really reaching this kind of situation where Russia is 22% totalitarian. Where is this going to go? We're seeing very small amounts of mobilization around what is effectively fascist symbolism, including this bizarre Z letter, which we've discussed. That's still not picking up anything like a majority of the population. But these things are all being pushed. And that's a radical shift, because the previous approach of this regime was a kind of hybrid authoritarianism, which basically said, if you stay out of politics, we're going to stay out of your life completely. Now the regime is coming into people's lives and beginning to control them. And this is going to mean that the regime's repression is something that tries to get inside your living room and is sort of permeating your life now in a way that could not just restrict your freedom, but even kind of traumatize you, because it's coming at you from all kinds of different directions, from work, from conversations in your building, because if you discussed, whether you should repair your fence in your building, there are going to be people ready to denounce you there, grass you up to the government. So it's now coming from the walls a little bit, When I was little in the Soviet Union and I'd missed the repressive period, my grandmother used to not seriously, but say to me that they're listening to you in the walls, so don't criticize the government. That wasn't true, of course, but that sense was appropriate for certain periods of the Soviet regime, certainly under Stalin, and little by little it's coming back. We'll be framing exactly what is going on, because it's really bizarre. It's got elements of reactionary Tsarism, it's got elements of Stalinism, it's got elements of fascism, but it's still got those elements of an informational autocracy too, which is the autocracy that wants to pretend it really has firm vertical control without necessarily having it. So it's such a sort of amorphous mixture that we'll need to keep talking about it. And that stuff inside, of course, impacts us, because what Russians accept, what Russian citizens accept, is going to impact Russia's external behavior on the world stage, and it's going to impact us. This was a bit long. Remarkable if you've managed to sit through all of it with me. Can't wait to talk in a more crisp and sharp and exciting way about something really cool, actually, on the main channel, I think in the next 48 hours, if not sooner. Bye-bye.